It's time for us to get started with our cutting. Now, in your DVD set, there is a CD with PDF files on it. Those PDF files have all of your yardage instructions and your cutting instructions. So you need to go print those off for yourself so that you have those in front of you when you're cutting. Basically, you are going to be using 3 fabrics. You have a main fabric, a contrast fabric, and your lining fabric. In addition to those fabrics, we have some faux suede that we're going to be using on the bottom of the bag and for the straps on the bag. Also, you will be cutting some fusible fleece and some shirt tailor interfacing. And I'd also like you to have on hand some sticky dots that are color coded. And what I'd like you to do is assign a color to each one of your fabrics. So you'll have one for your main fabric, one for your contrast, one for your lining, one for each of your interfacings, and for your faux suede. And we're going to be labeling each piece that we cut out with a sticky dot so that we can keep everything organized. Now, the PDF files that you will be printing out will tell you what letter or number to put onto the pieces that you're cutting. So I think you're ready. Let's begin our cutting. You guys go work and I'll work on mine, and we'll get back together and then I'll show you what the next step is. I've completed all of my cutting. I have my lining, my contrast, my main fabric, my shirt tailor interfacing, my faux suede, and my fusible fleece. I've kept everything grouped together, and I have the stickers on each piece that's been cut so that I know what that piece is. The next step is I'm going to actually sort all of these pieces together. So I will take all the A's, put those together in a pile, all the B's, put those together in the pile. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. I want you to do the same thing, just keep each letter together. And then after that, we'll come back and I'll show you what the next step is. Now remember, as you're sorting your pieces, make sure that each piece has a label on it. We did cut some duplicate pieces out, and all of those pieces need to be labeled. This way you can keep track of everything and you won't get confused later if you find a piece without a label. I've now finished sorting all of my pieces, so I have all of the same letters together. So for example, I have piece A for my main fabric, and then I have piece A for my fleece. Now also remember, I would like to point out to you, when you put your letters on, make sure that you put it onto the right side of the fabric so that it'll just be nice to know that you don't have to go looking at your fabric later on saying, oh, which is the right side? You've already put it on the right side. So that will help you speed up your sewing process later on. We had 2 A's, so I have another main fabric A and another fleece A. Then I go on to B. I have my main fabric for B, my fleece for B, and my contrast for B. And so on down the pile until you get everything matched up. We're about to move on to the fusing process. We're going to take each piece in our pile that has fusible interfacing with it, and we're going to fuse those pieces together. Now, let's remember, this bag is a process. The fusing, the cutting, all the things that we need to get to the point of sewing are our tuition. Everything after that is pure fun. To me, the sewing is pure fun. So I like to group all of these processes together so that I can get down to the machine, and once I'm there, I don't want to get up to fuse another piece of fabric. So this is how I like to do it. You don't have to do it this way, but to me, let's get all this stuff out of the way so that we can get on to the fun stuff. Now, I have here piece A and the fleece that goes with it. We're going to temporarily take the sticker off for A, for the main fabric, because we don't want to fuse with that on there. And I'm going to take the A off of the fleece, and that we actually don't need that one anymore. Now, when you're fusing, remember, there's a right side and a wrong side. You don't want to fuse the fleece down to your ironing board, so make sure that you have the rough side up. Figure out which side on the product that you're using is the correct side for fusing on. Also, I would like you to read the directions for the fusible fleece that you are using, because they each have their own set of directions, and most of the times you just steam it for 10 seconds or whatever, and it's good to go. So what you want to do is you want to really match up all of your edges here. Make sure everything is perfectly lined up. You're going to take your steam iron and you're going to hold it down on the fabric. And what I like to do is, at first, I like to just give it a little bit of a tack, just so that it doesn't shift. And then once it gets that little bit of tack onto it, then you can go ahead and just hold your iron in place for however long the directions tell you to. Now, when you're fusing your fleece to your fabric, we don't do any of this. It's put it down, give it a little shot of steam, and hold it there for however many seconds the directions tells you to do that. And then you move to the next spot. Now, if you're lucky enough to have an iron press, go ahead and use that. You'll be able to fuse this piece down in its entirety in just a few steps, which will go much faster for you. So we're done with piece A, which is our first one. Remember now, we have another piece A, so we're going to go ahead and do that one. And when we're done with this one, we'll move on to the next piece in the pile, and I'll show you how to fuse that. I'm ready to fuse piece B. B has 3 pieces here. We have the main fabric, the fleece, and the third one here, our contrast, is actually going to be a lining, and this is actually going to be one of our pleated pockets. So I'm going to go ahead and fuse this one. Now again, I take my sticker off, and remember, put the sticker back on when you're done with the fusing so that you don't forget what piece that is. So I'll put that aside for a second. I don't need the lining right now, so I'll move that out of the way. And I have my fusible fleece. I'm taking the sticker off of that one, and I'm turning the fleece to the right side. Now, I want you to notice something here. My fleece is shorter than piece B, and it's supposed to be shorter. The reason why I did this is because this little piece of fabric at the bottom is actually going to go into our seam, and we don't want to have all that extra bulk from the fleece in our seam. So what I want you to do is, I want you to go ahead and line that fleece up with the edges of either the top or the bottom of piece B. And I want you to fuse it from that point and leave this part open. So again, same thing. I take my iron, I just give it a little bit of steam to temporarily tack it down. And then once I'm done doing that, I go in and I hold it, steam it, and I hold it for the amount of time that the manufacturer tells me to. Whenever we have a piece where the fleece does not completely cover the fabric, we want to make sure that if our fabric has direction to it, that the fleece comes to the top. So in other words, if this was a person, a picture of a person on this fabric here, this was the feet and this was the head, we want the fleece to come to the part of the fabric where the head is. We want to leave the feet uncovered. Now I'm done fusing main fabric B to the fleece. I'm going to put the B back on it, and I'm going to rejoin this with the contrast B. There's nothing that we need to do with contrast B yet. This will be done in the sewing phase, and I'm just putting them back together to keep them together so that when I'm ready to sew, I have it right there at my fingertips. Now I have piece C. Piece C also has 3 pieces. It has the main fabric, a piece of fleece, and a piece of contrast. And the same thing is going to happen with piece C that happened with piece B. I take the letter off again, put it to the side. I line my fleece up with the fabric. Again, I take the sticker off, and again, the fleece is shorter than the fabric, and that's fine. We want it to be shorter. So I turn it over, and I'm going to go ahead now and fuse both of these pieces for C. I finished fusing my C pieces, and I'm putting the sticker back on, and I'm keeping everything together with the lining contrast. Now I have piece D. Piece D consists of the main fabric, a piece of fleece, and the lining fabric. With piece D, the fleece is slightly shorter than the main fabric, and we want it to be that way on this one also. So go ahead and fuse that piece now. Now I have piece E. Piece E consists of lining fabric and fleece. On this one, the fleece is exactly the same size as the lining. So what I want you to do is just go ahead and line everything up edge to edge and fuse that together. Also keep in mind that you have two E's, so you want to go ahead and fuse both of those. Now we're going to move on to pieces F and G. Both pieces F and G consist of a main fabric, fleece, and contrast fabric. Now don't get discouraged, guys. We're getting really close to the end here, so we're just going to keep moving on through until we finish so we can get on to the fun stuff. A couple of things I want to point out to you. On both pieces F and G, the main fabric and the fleece are exactly the same size. So what I want you to do is just fuse these pieces edge to edge all the way around. And don't panic that it's the same size. I wanted it to be the same size. So you didn't cut anything wrong. Another thing I want to point out to you is you may have noticed that the contrast fabric on a lot of these pieces are a little bit longer than the main fabric. That's okay. We want it to be that way, and you'll see later in the sewing process why it's a little bit longer. So you haven't cut anything wrong. Just keep on with your fusing. Now we're going to move on to piece H. Piece H has main fabric, fleece, and contrast. And on these three pieces, they're all exactly the same size. So you're going to go ahead and fuse those together. Don't panic. Everything is cut to the right size. You want them to all be the same exact size on this particular piece. So just go ahead and do your fusing. I have piece I here. Piece I has main fabric and fleece. They're both exactly the same size. Go ahead and fuse those. And remember, piece I, there are two pieces for this. So you're going to fuse two separate pieces. Now we have piece J. Piece J is a piece of lining fabric and a piece of shirt tailor interfacing. They're both exactly the same size. Again, you want to go and check your manufacturer's directions for fusing the shirt tailor interfacing to your lining. Okay guys, we're getting down to the wire here. We're going to do some fusing on our faux suede. I have piece K here. There are two pieces. It consists of the faux suede and a piece of shirt tailor interfacing. They're both exactly the same size, so we're going to line up edge to edge. Now, when you fuse this, I want you to actually fuse from the shirt tailor side. Just line up your edges and then go get yourself a piece of muslin or something. Put that over the fusible web here and then do your fusing from that side. I don't want you to fuse from the faux suede side. We're about to fuse our last piece. This is piece L, which will be our bag strap, and it's quite long. It's 60 inches long, and your fusible fleece is probably only about 45 inches wide. So what I'd like you to do is I would like you to lay in the fusible fleece end to end on the faux suede, and then you're going to come up short. And when you do, all you're simply going to do is cut another shorter piece, and you're just going to overlap it slightly. It doesn't have to be a lot. It can just be maybe 1/4 of an inch, and you're never going to know that that little lap joint is in there once everything is sewn together. We have the bag strap here. When you are fusing your fleece to the faux suede, you want to come 1 inch in from each end with your fleece. So in other words, the last inch of each end of the strap should not have any fleece fused to it. Welcome back. Now that you've all completed your fusing, we're going to move on to the next step. That will be taking all of our pieces and trimming them to the correct size. Now you may be wondering why we're going to trim them after they've been fused. Why didn't we just go ahead and cut everything exactly the size we wanted it to be in the first place? The reason why I've done this is I've made so many bags over the years, and I've used fusing, different types of fusing on different types of fabrics, and what I found is that I never end up with the size that it's supposed to be. There's always some shrinkage or some distortion. So I've learned that if I want to get the best possible results, what I do is I cut everything at least an inch bigger all the way around. And then after I go through my fusing, I cut everything to the exact size I want it to be. And I always end up with a perfectly square bag when I do this. So I prefer the results doing it this way. It is a little bit more work, but I'm much happier with the results I get. The other thing that I want to talk to you about is, because we are going to be doing some more cutting, is blade safety once again. I don't think we can ever say it enough. A few things to remember are, when you're done cutting, you want to make sure that you close your blade when you put it down. I rarely cut myself when I'm actually cutting with a rotary blade. I cut myself all the time because I forget to close it when I put it down. I go to grab for something and there you go. The other thing is, we always remember to cut away from ourselves, not towards ourselves. And last, use a sharp blade. Dull blades actually are an accident waiting to happen. You're struggling with the fabric, you're trying to cut, and all of a sudden, zip, there goes the blade because you're pressing way too hard on it. So, sharp blades, and that's all I'm going to say about that. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to cut both of our piece A's to size. We're going to start by cutting piece A. Now remember, you have two piece A's. Once it's cut, I have one here that I've already finished. It should be 19 inches wide by 14 inches high. And we're going to cut 2.5-inch squares out of each corner. So as you can see, I finished the first one. Now I'm going to go and cut second piece A. Now I have my second piece A here. It's ready to be cut. What I'd like to point out to you is, you want to make sure before you do any cutting that you're going to get your full 19 inches wide and 14 inches high. So what I do is I line this up on the mat just slightly over a yellow line, a yellow registration line on the mat, both this way and this way. Then I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to make sure that I'm going to get the full 19 and the full 14. So I look this way, and I'm lining my ruler up with this line right here, and I'm going out to 19 inches, and I see that I'm going to get my full 19 inches that way. Then I'm going to line my ruler up here, and I'm looking at this yellow line right here, and I'm going up to 14, and this is my 14-inch line right here. So I see that my piece is in a good place for cutting. So now I'm just going to go ahead and cut all around the square until it becomes 14 inches high by 19 inches wide. I have my ruler set up for my first cut, so I'm just going to go ahead and cut that first line there. Close my rotary blade and pull away that piece. Now I'm going to go set up for my second cut. I look to see where 19 inches is, and now I set my ruler up to make the second cut on the line that will give me 19 inches in width. Now I'm going to set my ruler up to cut along the bottom. I finished making my cut along the bottom. Now I'm going to line my ruler up and find out where 14 inches is at the top of the piece. It's right here. I'm going to move my ruler up to that line. I'm going to line up everything on my ruler, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut that piece. Now I've just finished making the cut, and I double check, and I see that I have 19 wide by 14 high. It's exactly the size I want it to be. The next step for me is to take one of my little rulers, and I'm going to mark 2.5-inch squares in each corner. So I line everything up. I use my little chalky wheel. Use whatever marking tool you're comfortable with. I love the little chalk wheels. I love the little clicky sound they make. Now for these, I actually cut them out with a pair of scissors. And I think it's good for us to all follow the carpentry rule. Measure twice, cut once. And that completes the cutting of my second piece A. Now that we've completed cutting out both piece A's, we have one more step. I've taken one of my piece A's and I've turned it with fleece side up. And what I would like to do now is mark a 1/2 inch sewing line completely around the perimeter of this piece. The reason why I do this is, again, it gives me a much better result in the end. I find that even though I can sew a perfectly straight 1/4 inch seam or 1/2 inch seam, when I start adding a lot of bulk underneath the presser foot, you lose some control, and sometimes my seams aren't as perfect as I'd like them to be. But if I have that line marked in there, I just follow that line and I get a better result. Again, yes, it's a little bit more tedious, it's a little bit more work, but the end product comes out so much better. So right now, I'd like everyone to go and mark their 1/2 inch seam lines with their rulers. I am using a very fine tip Sharpie to do this. Now, I actually don't ever wash my bags, although they can be washed. And the rare times that I have washed them, they come out very nicely. What I do is I wash them in cold water with a little bit of detergent. I do not put them in the dryer. As soon as they come out of the washer, I take them and I push them back into shape, and I just let them stand to dry. So I'm using the permanent Sharpie so that if I ever do decide to wash this, for whatever reason, usually it's because something spilled on it, I won't have to worry about this running later on in the washer. Okay, I finished marking all around. Make sure that you mark both pieces this way. We are about to cut piece B. Now, as you remember, on piece B, that was one of those pieces where the fleece didn't completely cover the fabric. When we cut these pieces, all of them, not just piece B, but every one where the fleece comes up short of the fabric, we're going to begin our cutting line from down here. So this would be placed on one of the yellow lines on your mat, and this is where we measure from, the edge of this piece right here. Now, this is the piece that will get caught into our seam, so we won't get that bulk from the fleece. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this. We need it to be 6.5 inches high by 19 inches wide. And again, I'm just going to first check with my ruler to make sure I'm going to get that measurement out of this piece where I have it placed on my mat. So I'm going to measure over from this line right here, and I see how I have my 19 inches. And then I'm going to measure over right from the bottom, and I see that I will get my 6.5 inches. So now I'm just going to go ahead and cut that piece. I have my ruler set up to make my first cut on piece B. And again, I'm measuring from the very bottom of that fabric up 6.5 inches. So I'm just going to take my rotary cutter, make that cut. I finished the cut. I'm taking away the piece of fabric. And now I'm going to go to the edge here. I'm going to make my first cut along the edge. Now I'm going to measure over 19 inches with my ruler. And I'm seeing where I need to place the ruler to make that second cut on the edge. And now I just want to confirm that I've cut everything correctly. I have 19 inches wide and 6.5 inches high. And my last step here for me is to mark my 1/2 inch seam line all the way around. Now I don't need to mark it down here, but I want to mark it on the fleece on these 3 sides. I finished cutting piece B, and I've also finished marking those seam lines. We're going to move on to piece C now. As I put this back in my pile, I'm remembering to keep its contrast piece with it so that I don't have to hunt for that later. I'm about to mark piece C. There are 2 of these pieces. I've already gone ahead and cut and marked the first one. And let's remember to keep your sticky dots on there so that we can identify them later. Now piece C is one of those pieces that has the fabric at the bottom. And we need to remember to measure up from that point right there. I've turned piece C over and I'm about to start cutting. I've lined up the edge of the fabric with one of the yellow lines on the mat. And we need to measure 7 inches high by 8.5 inches wide. And I'm going to go and cut that right now. So I'm making my cut at 7 inches. I've already measured to make sure that I have my 8.5 inch width that I need here. So if I start from this line and measure over to here, I can see that I have my 8.5 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this side. And now I measure 8.5 inches over to see where my ruler needs to be. I line everything up. I make my cut. And now I'm going to just make sure that I have 7 inches by 8.5 inches, and I do. So the only thing left for me to do now is to mark my 1/2 inch seam lines all around with my Sharpie. So that completes both PCs. I rejoin it with my lining fabric and I put this back into my pile and go on to the next piece. We're ready to move on to piece D. Piece D is again one of those pieces where we have the bare fabric on the bottom. So I'm going to line that up on my mat with the edge of the fabric on a yellow line. This needs to measure 6.5 inches high by 12.5 inches wide. So I'm going to take my ruler and make sure that I have the proper width. If I'm starting to cut at this line right here and I move over to my 12.5 inch line, I have enough to cut. And to get my 6.5 inches, I see that I have enough to cut there also. So I'm going to go ahead and line up my rulers and start my cutting. I have my ruler positioned on the yellow line at the edge of the fabric. So I'm making my first cut. Now I am going to cut my first end. And then I'm going to measure over 12.5 inches with my ruler to see where that cut needs to be. So I'm moving my ruler over to that mark now. And I'm going to go ahead and cut the other end. Now I'm just verifying that I have 6.5 inches high by 12.5 inches wide, and I do. Next step, we're going to mark our 1/2 inch seam lines. I finished cutting piece D. I've marked my seam lines. Still has my sticky dots on there so that I know that that's piece D. Now, please remember, it's really important not to cut any of this piece off here. We always measure up right from this edge when we're cutting our final piece out. And rejoin it with its contrast piece and put that one in the pile. We're going to cut piece E now. We do have 2 piece E's to cut. It needs to be 19 inches wide by 21 inches high. So you again want to take your ruler and make sure that you have everything positioned so that you will get those measurements with your cuts. So I'm looking here and I'm seeing that I have my 21 inches and I have my 19 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and start cutting those lines. I'm finishing up my last cut. And now I'm just going to verify that I have 21 high by 19 wide, and I do. Now that we're finished cutting piece E, we need to take a 2.5 by 10 inch wedge out of 2 sides of the fabric. And we're going to do this along the side that measures 21 inches. So this is my 21 inches this way. I'm placing my ruler. Two 2.5 inches by 10 inches. I'm going to mark this with my Sharpie. If you prefer, you can mark it from the other side with your chalk wheel. Doesn't really matter. I have my 2.5 by 10 inch wedge marked out on both sides of my piece. Again, measured along the 21 inch side. And then, just like I did with piece A, I'm just going to cut this out with a pair of scissors. If you feel confident cutting it out with your rotary cutter, go ahead and do that. I'm always worried that I'm going to slip and cut into my piece. So I prefer to use the scissors. After cutting out the wedges on my piece, I went and marked my 1/2 inch seam lines completely around the perimeter. And that completes the preparation for piece E. So we can put that one in our pile and go on to the next piece. We're about to start preparing piece F. Now, piece F is completely fused on the underside, so we don't have to worry about cutting up from that raw edge here. I'm going to place it on my mat. It needs to measure 7 high by 13 wide. So I'm first going to verify that I can get a full 7 inches by 13 inches, and I can. So I'm just going to start cutting. I'm making my last cut. And now I'm turning this over. I'm going to mark my 1/2 inch seam lines, and I only need to mark these 3 edges. I finished preparing piece F, which means also drawing in my 1/2 inch seam lines along 3 edges. So you need to have a seam line on both sides and along one side here. Now, normally it doesn't matter if this line were here or here. unless your fabric has a direction to it. Let's say that I'm using fabric that has a picture of a person on it. These would be the feet down here. This would be the head up here. I want to place that seam line where the head is. So any fabric that needs a direction with an up-down, you want this to be at the top. So now we've finished completing piece F and everything is completely marked with this mark at the top. And I'm going to rejoin it with its contrast and put that in my pile, and I will move on to piece G. I have piece G here, and we're going to start preparing that right now. On this piece, the fleece is fully covering the fabric, so we don't have to worry about that little piece of fabric without the fleece on it this time. I'm lining up on my mat. I want this to be 6.5 inches high by 13 inches wide. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to make sure that I have enough fabric to cut out my 13 inches, and I do. And then I'm going to look this way and make sure that I have enough to cover my 6.5 inches, and I do. So I'm going to go ahead and take my first cut now. Now I'm just going to make sure that my piece is measuring 13 inches in width and 6.5 inches in height, and it is. And the only thing left for me to do now is to mark 3 sides with my 1/2 inch seam line. So I'm going to be marking here, here, and here. Okay, we have piece G completed. I'm going to put it back with its contrast and throw that over into my pile. And then we're going to move on to piece H. I have piece H here, and piece H has the main fabric and the contrast. What I want you to do right now is I want you to go ahead and take those sticky dots off of this one. And this is the only one that I want you to do it to. We're not going to use this anymore. We're not going to call this piece H anymore, because what we're actually going to do is we're going to subdivide this into smaller pieces that will end up being our bag flaps. And then once our bag flaps are cut, we're going to reassign them the letters that they need for the pockets that they go with. I'm taking my contrast piece away for right now, and I'm only going to work with the main fabric and the fleece. And I want to work from the fleece side. And I'm going to be drawing a series of lines on here, which eventually will be the lines that we use to subdivide this piece into our flaps. So we're going to take a ruler and we're just going to mark a straight line at the bottom of the piece with our black Sharpie. Then I want you to mark up from that black line 3 1/4 inches. Okay, so far we have a black line along the bottom here and another one that's 3 1/4 inches up from this line here. Now I want you to mark 1/2 of an inch above this line. And now, up from this line, I want you to mark another 3 1/4 inches. Then up from this line, I want you to mark up another 1/2 inch. And then up from this line that you just drew, I want you to mark up another 3 1/4 inches. What you should have now are basically 3 sections, 1, 2, and 3. Each section is going to measure 3 1/4 inches. So this is 3 1/4 inches, this is 3 1/4 inches, and this is 3 1/4 inches. And in between each section you should have a 1/2 inch space. So we have a 1/2 inch here and a 1/2 inch here. Now the next thing I want you to do is I want you to mark a line near the edge of the fabric that is perpendicular to the lines that you just drew. And on this first section here, I want you to mark out a line that is 6 inches parallel to this line right here. So I'm marking in 6 inches. Line everything up. And now I have 6 inches, this line being parallel to this line. Now I'm going to mark 1/2 inch up from that last line that I just drew. So I have a 1/2 inch space here. And from this line, I'm going to mark over 6 inches again. Try and keep everything nice and square and parallel. So now what you should have here are 2 rectangles that are both 3 1/4 inches high by 6 inches wide. 3 1/4 inches high by 6 inches wide. Now we're going to work in this next section. And what I would like you to do is mark 5 1/2 inches over from this first line that we drew here. I'm lining up, and I'm drawing my first line. Okay, so this one is 5 1/2 inches from my first line. Now, I'm going to mark another line that's 1/2 inch away from that last one that I just drew. So now I have a 1/2 inch space. And now from this line, I'm going to draw over another 5 1/2 inches. So I'm placing my ruler. I'm making sure that everything is square and parallel. And I'm marking my line. So what we should have in this second section here are 2 rectangles. They're each 3 1/4 inches high, and they're each 5 1/2 inches in width. And now we're going to draw one more up here in this third section. And what we want to do this time is we want to mark over from that line 9 1/2 inches. Line your ruler up carefully. Make sure everything's square and parallel. Mark your line. So this last third section is just going to have one piece that's 3 1/4 inches high by 9 1/2 inches wide. And these are the pieces that you need for your bag flaps. And in one more minute, we're going to continue to do some more marking on this piece. Okay, next step for this piece here is we are going to continue to mark some more lines in each of these sections. And right now, we're only going to be working with this section right here. These are your 6 inch pieces. First thing I want you to do is subdivide each of those 6 inch pieces in half. So you're going to be measuring 3 inches over from this end. Again, when you're lining up your rulers, make sure that everything is square and parallel. And now, from this line, measure 3 inches over. Mark your line. And the next thing I want you to do is I want you to mark up 3/4 of an inch from this bottom line here on both pieces. So what you have at this point now are your two 6-inch pieces. They're each divided in half, and they're each marked 3/4 of an inch up from this bottom line here. Next, what I want you to do is draw a diagonal line from this point here to this point here. So I have my two diagonal lines. I have my two diagonal lines drawn in. And now I'm going to do the same thing here. So here are my two 6-inch pieces with the diagonal lines. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to mark 1/2 an inch out from this side line, this diagonal line, this diagonal line, and this diagonal line. So I just take my ruler, I line it up, I mark in 1/2 inch. Then I mark in another 1/2 inch up from that first diagonal line, a 1/2 inch up from the second diagonal line, and then a 1/2 inch in from that other side line. Now these lines that we just drew in are our stitching lines. When we sew these flaps, we are going to be sewing on these lines right here. These outer lines right here are our cutting lines. And we'll go over this in detail when we sew them so that you won't be confused. Right now, all we're doing is marking. Now I'm going ahead and I'm marking in those 1/2 inch lines on the second piece. Same way I did the first one. So now on my two 6-inch pieces, I have all the lines marked that I need to sew these flaps. Now we're going to work in this second section. We're going to do the same thing we did here. We're going to be dividing this piece in half. This section is 5.5 inches, so we need to measure in 2 3/4 from each end. We'll measure in 2 3/4 from this line and 2 3/4 from this line. So I'm lining up my ruler. Everything is square and parallel, and I mark my line. I'm marking in 2 3/4 from this line. Everything's square and parallel, and I mark my line. So now I have my two 5.5 inch sections that have been both divided in half with these lines here. Next thing I'm going to do is mark 3/4 of an inch from this line up. So I'm marking 3/4 of an inch on this first 5.5 inch piece, and then 3 1/4 inches up on this 5.5 inch piece. Now we have the two 5.5 inch pieces that have each been marked with the 3/4 inch line up from this line here. Next, I'm going to mark diagonal lines from here to here and from here up to here. You're just drawing from point to point. That's all you're doing. Pretend you're back in geometry class. Figure out the angles. Somebody email me and tell me what these angles are. Okay, so now in these 5.5 inch sections, I've marked the diagonal lines on both. And the last thing that you're going to do now is mark the 1/2 inch sewing line from the lines that we just drew in. Line up, draw your lines, draw a 1/2 inch up from the diagonal lines, and a 1/2 inch in from your cutting line. And we're going to do the same thing on this piece. Mark in a 1/2 inch from the cutting line on the side, 1/2 inch up from the first diagonal line, 1/2 inch up from the second diagonal line, and 1/2 inch in from the side cutting line. So now you have your two 5.5 inch pieces, which have been completely marked with your cutting lines. Those are the outer lines there, and your stitching lines. Now we're going to work on the third section here. And what we want to do again is first divide this in half. This was 9.5 inches, so we're going to mark in 4 3/4 inches from that outside line right there. Line everything up, mark your line. And now I want to measure 3/4 of an inch up from this line here and mark a line all the way across. Now I'm going to draw a diagonal line from this point right here down to this center point right here. When we draw these lines, remember, we're staying within this 3/4 inch space here. So the diagonal line is only going across the 3/4 inch space. Okay, I just finished marking my diagonal lines, and those diagonal lines are only in that 3/4 of an inch space. And my last thing to do is to mark in my stitching lines 1/2 inch up from the lines that I just drew. So I'm marking the first one in from my side cutting line. I'm marking the next one 1/2 an inch up from that first diagonal line. I'm marking the next one 1/2 inch up from the second diagonal line. And then I'm marking the last one 1/2 inch in from that outside cutting line. And now you've marked all the flaps that you need for the bag. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rejoin this piece with the contrast. Next thing I'm going to do, I want to cut in between the first section and the second section. So I'm going to place my ruler right in the middle of that half-inch space that I created, and I'm going to cut with my rotary cutter to divide these two pieces. Now you don't have to be accurate with this. This is just separating them, but you do want to be careful that you don't cut into your flaps. You just want to cut into the space that we created for the flaps. So I'm going to put this one aside for a second. And now I want to separate these two sections. So again, I'm going to go into that half-inch space, and I'm going to cut with my rotary cutter to separate those two sections. Put that one aside for a second. And now this last one here, we don't need all this above. I just left some extra so you had some room to play with if you needed it. And I'm just going to cut just a little bit above that right now because we don't need it. Okay. Now, this one here, I'm just going to take this little tail off the end. And I'm going to put that one aside for a minute. I'll bring it back in a second. We want to take these two pieces, cut those in the half-inch space to separate them. And take off the little tail that's remaining here. We're going to keep those together. And then I will take my first section that I worked on, separate those by cutting in the half-inch space. And then I'm going to cut off that little bit of a tail there. And now what I want to do is I want to remark these pieces with stickies so that I know which pockets they go to. The ones that were your 6-inch section, so these are my 6-inch wide flaps. Those are going to go on the front of the bag. And I need to mark those with a B. And now I know that I need to put those aside with all of my B pieces. The second section here, those were my 5.5-inch wide pieces. And those are the side flaps. So I'm going to mark those with a C and put those with all my C pieces so that I know that they go with my pockets that are marked PC. And my last one here, this one goes on the outside flap of the bag. And that will be piece D. That goes on the pocket on the outside flap. And that's all that there is to marking these flaps. I know it's a little involved, but just go through it step by step and you shouldn't have any problem marking all of your flaps. We're about to prepare piece I. Piece I needs to be 14 inches wide by 17.5 inches high. So I'm taking my ruler to make sure that I have enough here to get those measurements in the piece that I have. I have enough to do my 17.5 inches high. And I have enough to do my 14 inches wide. So now I'm going to take my first cut on the edge. Now I'm just going to check and make sure that I have 17.5 inches high and 14 inches wide. Next step, I'm going to turn over and I'm going to mark 1/2 inch sewing lines all around 3 edges. Now again, the same thing applies here. This is the top, okay? This time, we do not want to have a sewing line along the top. We want the sewing line to go along the bottom. So if you have directional fabric, here are the feet, here's the head. This sewing line is going to be marked where the feet are. So it's a little bit different than before. All right, now I need you to go find something that's 2.5 inches in diameter. I am using a little circle template that we use for our long arm quilting. And I have actually sprayed one side of it with Pam's basting spray so that it doesn't slide on me when I'm using it. What I want to do is I want to place the edges of these circle along this line and this line here. So I'll turn it this way so that you can see what I'm actually doing here. I'm placing down the template and I'm making sure that the template is touching this line and this line. And then I'm just going to take a pen, my little Sharpie, and score that so that I have a rounded edge there. And this little rounded edge is actually going to be your stitching line. And now I will do the other side. Doing the same thing. I'm making sure that the circle is touching both this line and this line. And now I have my rounded edges for sewing. And that completes this piece here, piece I. We're about to prepare our last piece. Now, what we want to do is we want to take piece J. This is the one that we put the shirt tailor interfacing on. We want to actually fold it in half and press a crease in it on the fold. You want to take your fold and place it on one of the yellow lines on the mat. And we're going to measure 9.5 inches up from this fold and cut along the width of the fabric here. So I'm going to take this ruler and I'm going to measure 9.5 inches up to see where I need to place my ruler. I'm going to line up my ruler. And I'm going to take my cut. And now I want to measure from here to here 12.5 inches. So I'm just going to make sure that I have enough to do my 12.5 inches, and I do. So I'm going to start by cutting the end on this side. I'm lining up my ruler, taking my cut. Now I measure 12.5 inches in from this end to see where I need to place my ruler. Take my next cut. And now you're done. You don't need to go ahead and draw any stitching lines on this piece because we're not working with any bulk here. And this piece usually is not hard. If you really want to, go ahead and mark it, but it's not necessary. If you do decide to mark it, just go in 1/2 inch around each side. Obviously, you don't need to mark anything along the bottom. We will not be sewing a stitching line along the folded edge. So that's it. You're done. And congratulations for doing a great job. Now the fun stuff begins. We are actually going to start sewing. So what I'd like you to do is pull out all of your pocket pieces, and I'm going to tell you which letters they are. You'll need piece B, the one that's been fused with the main fabric, plus its contrast. You'll need both piece C's, which were fused to the main fabric, and their contrast. You'll need piece D with the main fabric that was fused with its contrast. You'll need piece F with main fabric and its contrast, and piece G that was fused to the main fabric and its contrast. You do not need the flaps right now. We'll do those in the next step. Right now, these are the pieces that I want you to have ready for sewing. So let's get started. We'll begin our sewing by doing some pinning. I have main fabric which has been fused on piece B, and I'm going to turn that over and I'm going to pin right sides together with my contrast piece. I'll be pinning along this top edge here, and the first line we're going to sew is that stitching line right across the top. So we'll pin. You don't need to put in too many, just enough to hold everything in place as you run these through the machine. And again, we'll be batching up different processes together. So we'll be sewing across all the pocket tops. Now remember, when you have a piece that has not been fused on the bottom, that's the bottom. You don't want to pin to that side. So that's piece B. I have my piece C, and there are two of these, so we're going to pin those. I'm pinning my second piece C here. Again, the piece of fabric at the bottom that has no fusible fleece on it, that's the bottom. I'm pinning to the opposite end. This is piece D. We'll pin those two right sides together. Now you notice that all these contrast pieces are larger than the pocket, than the main fabric. And that's okay, we're going to take care of all that later. So go ahead and pin the rest of your pockets. And then we'll meet you over at the sewing machine and we'll sew those top seams. I'm pinning piece G now. Piece G does have fusible fleece along the bottom, but we're pinning where we marked our stitching line up here at the top. Be careful, especially if you do have those directional fabrics. You don't want to sew your seam on the wrong side. And the last one I'm pinning together here is piece F. Also has the fusible fleece on the entire piece of fabric. I also want to remind you guys, still keep those stickers on there that identify each piece. We don't want to lose those stickers. Okay, let's go meet over at the sewing machine and sew these babies up. Okay, we're about to start sewing our first seam. I've darkened all of the stitch lines so that you can see them a little better. I am using a straight stitch. My needle is set to the middle position and I'm using a stitch length of 2.5. I have an open toe foot on here, so I have clear visibility of the line that I've drawn out for you. And right in the center of my open toe foot there's a little red dot, and that little red dot is just going to ride right along that line. Now we're starting with pocket B, and I'm just going to sew along the top of pocket B. So I just start to sew, back stitch, keep that needle right on your black line there. Back stitch, and we're done sewing across pocket B. Now I'm going to slip pocket C in there. We have two pocket C's. This is the first one. Back stitch. Back stitch at the end. I'll slip in the second pocket C. back stitch. Make sure nothing's caught up underneath your pocket where your stitch line is going. Next step for our pockets is we're going to iron the contrasting fabric, which will be the lining of our pockets. So I have pocket B here. I'm folding up the contrast fabric, and I'm going to press that seam right now. After I press it, I'm going to fold it to the back of the fabric. I'm going to turn it over, make sure everything is nice and snug. I'm going to press it down. And then I'll go ahead and I'll press it on this side also. And now I'm going to put this aside, and we're going to work on this some more when we get over to the cutting board. I get the next pocket, same thing, fold the contrast fabric up, press it, fold it back down to the inside of the pocket, press it, turn it over, press it again. And then I put that one aside for the cutting board. We're going to continue and do the same thing to every pocket. We're going to do some more work on our pockets. What I'd like you to do is go ahead and trim all of this excess contrast fabric off. So you take your ruler, line up to the edge of your main fabric, cut. Going to turn the work towards me so that I can work with it a little easier. I'm lining my ruler up to the edge of the main fabric. I cut. And now I'm going to trim the fabric off of the bottom. Make sure that you line your ruler up with the edge of the main fabric there. That's all you need to do. Now, next step, I'm going to open this up. And I'm going to flip the contrast fabric so that I have right sides together, right side of the contrast with the right side of the main fabric. And now I'm going to pin my sides. Make sure that your edges are even. Just a couple of pins are enough. You can see my seam line there. And I'm lining up the other side, right sides together. I'm pinning. We don't want to pin the bottom. We're not going to sew across the bottom, just the sides. Okay, so we have our sides pinned. We don't pin the bottom. We're not going to sew along there. Now, you might notice that there's a little pleat in here, and that's okay. You want that to be there because when we flip this back, after we sew our side seams down, we're going to flip this back over, and this is just the extra fabric that's needed to fill in that space as it flips back. So each one of your pockets needs to be prepared the same way now. I want you to go ahead and prepare all your pockets exactly the way we did this one. We finished pinning our pocket side seams. Remember, you have this little flap of fabric right here that's going to get sewn right down into the seam. And we are going to sew right down all the way to the bottom on that stitching line. So go ahead and put in your pocket. I'm still working with a straight stitch, center needle position, with a stitch length of 2.5. Back stitch. Follow that line. Go all the way to the bottom. Back stitch. Snip your threads and go ahead and sew the other side of the pocket. Back stitch. We're moving on to our next step with the pockets. The first thing I'd like to do is trim out these corners because we're going to be turning this piece right side out and we want to get as much bulk out of the seam line as we can. So I'm going to mark where I'm trimming with the black Sharpie marker so that you can see it. You don't have to do this, I'm just doing it so that you can see it. And again, you just want to be careful not to clip into your seam line. So I just take my scissors and clip. Now when I say don't clip into your seam line, I'm talking about this one right up here. I'm not talking about this one here. So this is the one that you don't want to clip. Next step, I'm going to take my iron. I'm going to fold this back and I'm going to press. I'll turn it and now I'm going to press this side open. Now I flip it. I want to press this side open. And next I will press this side open. Once I've pressed the seams, I can go ahead and turn right side out. I'm going to push the corners out with my fingers. And then I'll take my little point turner again and very gently push those corners out. Not too aggressive with that now. We don't want to punch anything through. Remember, that is a weak spot on your piece. And even though we didn't clip the seam line there, you still have the danger of poking through. Next thing I do is I'm just going to roll these seams with my fingers, and I again want to see the edge of both fabrics. I don't want any of the green spilling over to the purple side, and I don't want any of the purple spilling over to the green side. I want to see them dead even in the center. And when I do that, I just take my iron and I press it in place. And just work your way down the seam and press. Then I'll turn it, and I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Careful not to sew your stickers in. Press. And don't panic if something goes wrong and you need to rip out a seam. That's why we have seam rippers. I know it's frustrating sometimes and it slows us down a little, but we all have to do it. And I'm just going to give everything a little bit of a press here. And that's it. Now what you need to do is you need to go and prepare every single pocket that you have in the same way. Remember, some of them have fleece covering the bottom, or the fleece is completely covering the main fabric, and some don't. This one does not. It doesn't matter if the fleece is completely covering the main fabric or not. You're still going to prepare each pocket the way I just did this one. And once you're done with that, the next stop for the pockets will be the sewing machine. I'd like you to take all of your pocket pieces right now, and we're going to do two things here. We're going to stitch in the ditch right here, and then we're also going to baste close the bottom of the pocket. We're going to do this for all the pockets. So I have my first one in the machine. I'm using an open toe foot. I'm using a straight stitch at 2.5, a stitch length of 2.5, and my needle is in center position. So I start stitching, I back stitch, and then I'm going to stitch all the way across the top here. Try and stay in that ditch as much as you can. Back stitch at the end. Okay, I'm going to take my work out and trim my threads. And now I'm just going to baste that bottom closed. And I just keep this machine at the 2.5. It'll work out fine like that. If you want to lengthen up that, if you want to increase that stitch length, you can, but you don't need to. Now when this gets sewn into the bag, we're going to be sewing it in at a 1/2 with a 1/2 inch seam. So you just want to make sure that you don't go over that 1/2 inch. You want to stay within the edge and the 1/2 inch when you're basting. And that's it. Go ahead and do that for every single pocket that you have.